Tell me how to use it.
So this one, where's this is. Oh no, this is the one we were going to see, but the one afterwards we're seeing. Oh, okay. She's zooming in. I saw her on something else recently. So who's the guy? Not unified, is it? He's an overseas. Mark Willacy. Oh yeah, that's right. So she's no, that wasn't her. No, it was not. No. But then Sharon Davis. She wasn't her yesterday with someone. Samantha. She was on lady. That lady was It is time. They've started there. It is time because the microphone's on. Before we start, can I ask you all to turn off your mobile phones, please? And also, I need to just do a little bit of housekeeping. Thank you for attending Adelaide Writers' Week. You're the people that make this week special, as well as the authors, of course. I need to reinforce some key conditions of the COVID management plan approved by SA Health. Please maintain social distancing wherever possible, and we're strongly encouraging the wearing of masks and ask you to follow directions given by the COVID marshals, venue staff and volunteers. And thank you very much for all of that and your cooperation. And welcome to this session of the Adelaide Writers Festival. I'm Sharon Davis. Before I introduce our guests, and there are two guests, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we're meeting on today, the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains, who lived down there by the river and hunted on this ground for thousands of years, and pay our respect to their elders, past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to acknowledge any members of the community that may be in the audience. Now to our guests. I'm sure many of you would have seen the footage on Four Corners in a program called Killing Field. A man lies cowering in a field, knees drawn up, clutching prayer beads. An Australian soldier stands over him, weapon raised. The man on the ground is an Afghan villager, unarmed, offering no threat. Shots ring out and his life ends. That footage resulted in an Australian Federal Police war crimes inquiry. It was also added to a list of atrocities being investigated by Judge Paul Breton. His inquiry, at the behest of the Inspector General of the Defence Force, would last 4 years. Mark Willacy was the journalist responsible for the Four Corners documentary. He's the author of Rogue Forces, an explosive account of Australian SAS war crimes in Afghanistan. And it's certainly that and much more. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you.
Joining us also via Zoom is Samantha Crompvoets, a sociologist and author of Bloodlust, Trust and Shame. It was Samantha's interviews with serving Special Forces soldiers which fuelled the Breton inquiry. Samantha was meant to be here today, but has been isolated by the floods and landslides in northern New South Wales. Welcome, Samantha. I hope everything's a little drier up there than it was when I was up there last week.
It is. Thanks for having me.
What these two have done under difficult circumstances is shine a light into the very secretive world of the Special Forces in a period of Australia's military history which is both shocking and shameful. The Breton report sets out how 39 Afghans were allegedly unlawfully killed by 25 Australian soldiers. Their actions have been described to Samantha by their colleagues as competition killing and bloodlust. How can this be? The SAS are usually lauded as the best trained, best equipped, elite warriors of the Australian Defence Force. And a warning, some of what you're about to hear from both of our authors could be distressing. Mark, to you first of all, and that incredible Four Corners, how did you get hold of that footage?
Well, I've been investigating alleged war crimes by the SAS in Afghanistan for a number of months at that point. And I'd done this story for the 7:30 program, and we'd done a digital version for the ABC's online site. And one thing we do is we put in the author or the journalist's email address. And so I get a lot of emails, you know, all about invisible ASIO suits right through to, you know, serious things that you can stack up. And this one day I got an email popped into this address from an anonymous author. And this person had clearly been at this particular SAS raid where 2 Afghans, civilians, had been killed, and killed allegedly in cold blood. And this author set out who was there, what he'd seen, and all this extra detail about other things that had happened. And, you know, it's not often in a journalist's career where you get that deep throat contact where you go, my God, I've actually made a connection here with someone who actually knows what's happened on the ground. And so I went back and forth with this individual. He sent me photos of certain people in his squadron, some of whom he said were behind alleged war crimes. And over the course of weeks and then months, he still wouldn't tell me anything about himself. I convinced him to meet me somewhere. So he said, all right, we'll fly interstate, go to this hotel lobby and get a room. I'll meet you in the lobby. We'll go up to the room and I'll talk to you. So it's, you know, something out of a bit of a Hollywood movie. And anyway, I do that, and this guy comes up to me in the lobby, and, you know, he's a big guy with sort of hair hanging down to his shoulders, bit of a beard. He looks exactly like you'd expect an SAS guy to look. And he sort of thrusts out his hand. He doesn't tell me his name. We go up to the room. We start talking. He tells me incredible tales, you know. And the thing is, I'm thinking the whole time, this is from someone who was there. He hasn't heard this secondhand, or he heard it, you know, back at base years later. And at the end of the meeting, he pulls out this little stick. He hands it to me and he says, on that, hundreds of photographs from that deployment and hours of video. Wow. And I said, well, what can I do with that? He said, do whatever you want with it. And he thrusts out his hand. He said, my name's Braden, by the way. And we know that now Braden Chapman appeared in that Four Corners and very bravely spoke about what he saw. But I went back to Brisbane. I spent 2 weeks going frame by frame by frame by frame through all of these videos. I think it was 10 to 12 hours worth. And it was a Friday evening. I'm looking at some of the last videos, and as you described, it starts like every other raid. They're on a helicopter. They land in a wheat field. They scoot out. There's a dog handler. He's the guy with the video camera on his helmet. They track this man. They let the dog go. The dog mauls the guy in the field. I'm thinking, wow, they're just going to zip tie him and take him away or question him. And instead, the soldier looming above him turns to the dog handler, looks right down the barrel of that camera, and he says, "Do you want me to drop this C?" And the dog handler, he's puffed from running or adrenaline, and he says, "I don't know, mate, hit such and such up. I can't give you the name, but it's the patrol commander." So he turns to him and he says, "Do you want me to drop this C?" And obviously the patrol commander can't hear, but he repeats the question.
C is, by the way, an expletive. It's not his name.
Yeah, that's right. And I'm thinking there is no way they're going to shoot this guy. He's got no weapon. He's immobile. He's probably wounded from the dog. He's cowering in fear. His hands are up and all I can see is red prayer beads. And then he just puts 3 bullets into him. And it's one of those moments as a journalist where you can't believe what you're seeing. And I remember looking around in the newsroom Friday evening, see who maybe saw what I was looking at. No one was really around, and I put the lid down, and I went and I rang my editor in Sydney, and I said, "I think we've just got a war crime on camera." And, I knew it was going to be big, and I knew it was going to cause a lot of controversy and possible heartache for certain people, but we had to get it out there.
I think someone in the military at the time described it to you as a game changer, didn't they?
Yeah, I got called by a guy who was very senior, and he just said to me, "You know what that video's done?" He said, "There were a lot of people in the military going, nah, this couldn't have happened. It's too far-fetched." He said, "That video showed just how easy it happens." Because one of the things that really blew me away in the video, other than the actual act of killing, was the way that the soldier then just strode off through the wheat, walked off like nothing had happened. And the dog handler calls the dog back and he sort of strokes its neck and off they go. And I thought at that point, wow, it looks like they've done this before. And it wasn't until months and months later after the story went to air that we worked out that that same soldier had killed another Afghan, a disabled Afghan, a couple of months earlier.
Your book focuses on the stories of 3 soldiers who you call A, B and C. Why are they anonymous?
Well, I just didn't want to end up in defamation suits for the next 50 years, I think. But, I think we could defend those defamation suits quite easily. But I think one of the reasons is I want... If this is all going to work, the justice system and bringing people to account, I think the justice system has to work this through. As a journalist, I can reveal the act, the allegations, and talk the audience through what we think happened. But I believe... I don't want to do anything that's going to jeopardise what is now a full-scale war crimes investigation, the first of its type in this country's history. I think they've got to work that out, and if they think charges are warranted, then charges will be brought, and then we'll battle it out in court.
Reports on all of these incidents that you mention and the one that you've talked about just now are compiled back at the base by a compiler. How was the shooting described in the report that then goes up the echelons of the Defence Force?
Yeah, so they come back, they have a patrol debrief, they write up the report, and in that particular case they wrote that the Afghan was 15 to 20 metres away when he was shot from the guy who shot him. He was tactically manoeuvring, which is sort of a euphemism for, he was obviously trying to evade them, or he was going to a weapons cache, or he was posing some sort of threat, and that he had a radio in his hand, which made him fair game. And in this case, it was a rare case, the Afghans actually complained about this particular killing. The Australians sent over an inquiry team to have a look at it. They had a look at it and they ruled that it was a lawful killing because all the SAS soldiers told them the same thing. The guy was 15 to 20 metres away, tactically manoeuvring, had a radio, fair game, we shot him. And they took photos after, showed he had a radio and a mobile phone. And I actually ended up speaking to one of the inquiry officers for the book who ruled that it was a lawful killing. And I said to him, "What did you think when you saw the 4 corners and you saw what actually happened?" And he said, "I felt like a schmuck." But he said, "We just didn't think Australia's soldiers could do that." And I think that was the problem, is that we held these guys up on a pedestal as superheroes who were morally, beyond question.
This radio that he had on him becomes a constant theme in the book in a way. It's called a throwdown. Can you just explain the concept of throwdown and how that's used by these particular soldiers and the actions that you were examining?
So a throwdown can be like an AK-47 assault rifle or a grenade or a pistol. In fact, there was one pistol called the Magic Makarov, a Russian Makarov pistol that sort of kept appearing in photograph after photograph, and also a radio. And it started out that what would happen if they'd accidentally killed someone they'd found that wasn't carrying a weapon or a radio or wasn't a hostile threat, they'd put something on them just to cover the mistake. But with a few of these more, let's say, psychotic individuals, this blood sport developed and the throwdown became something to put on a body to justify the kill. And in the end, you know, back at base, no one ever asked any questions. There were people who were noticing things like this one AK-47 with teal-coloured tape around the stock that kept cropping up.
I think a Russian Makarov pistol.
Yeah, the magic Makarov was extremely magical. And grenades, because they were easy to carry. There was one engineer who carried rifles that I was told about. And so the throwdown became part of the whole act of murder. It became part of the cover-up and the justification. And the arrogance of it after a while was that these same weapons would crop up. In fact, you know, a guy from a certain agency that was also over there, an Australian agency, spoke to me and said, we actually pulled them up and said, hey, this one AK-47's cropped up here, here and here. What's going on? But they still did it.
Samantha, if we can turn to you, you're a sociologist by profession, and sometime before this Four Corner, quite some time actually, before this Four Corners was ever aired, you'd been employed by the Defence Forces to prepare some reports. But what led you down the track of doing interviews about what happened in Afghanistan?
So I mean, it started off quite, I guess, quite differently to how it ended. I was engaged to write a research report in the wake of the Lindt Cafe siege, really looking at the Special Forces capability and its sort of future role in domestic counterterrorism. So as a part of that, I was speaking to a lot of very senior bureaucrats across different federal agencies around what their perspective of what the Special Forces capability did and how well it collaborated with DFAT or the AFP and the like. And it was in those conversations that there were a few things insinuated about how far the Special Forces could be trusted. And it was from there, really, that I just started asking some different questions around what those insinuations were about, and then spoke to more people internal to Special Forces.
When you say insinuations, I think Special Forces were described to you in some of those interviews as off the reservation.
Yeah, off the reservation as being highly capable, but being required to be on a short leash, you know, that they should be treated like children in a sense. So there was this sense that, yeah, they were off the reservation, that they would go job hunting quite independently of the chain of command or, the Chief of Army back in Australia. So there was clearly some knowledge that things weren't all okay in Special Forces. And it was when I sort of went down that avenue of questioning with both ex-serving and current serving soldiers, a lot about really trying to understand how the structure of Special Forces worked and also the tensions between the commandos and the SAS. That's when these very candid disclosures occurred of alleged war crimes.
Well, that was kind of the second part of what you were doing, wasn't it? Because it was what you were hearing in the first part that sent you back to, I think, the head of Special Forces Operations Command at the time, Jeff Sengelman, and said, what the fuck's going on here? Excuse my expletive, and he then said to you, do more work, do more reporting, but don't talk to Special Forces Command HQ because none of them can be trusted. What was he saying there?
I think there was, at the time, there was a high likelihood that things were being leaked back to Perth, that there would be, I think what happens is that those special forces, that sort of brotherhood can organise and all sing from the same song sheet. And so there was this sort of, only a few weeks really where there was this opportunity to go and have these conversations with people who were willing to speak really openly, some of them anonymously, but just to really tell their story, and in the hope that it would stop and that people would be held to account.
And what were they telling you?
There were a range of things that went from the, I guess, compared to war crimes, so it's probably seen as a low-level misconduct, but the use of drugs and alcohol, both in barracks here in Australia, but also on operations, the collection of souvenirs from Afghans that had been killed, and just, a number of people just talked to me about the challenge they had, or the struggle they'd had in trying to challenge the behaviour that they were seeing, that they felt really uneasy about, and how that had broken them as men in their inability to do anything about it. And then there were stories of what some of these soldiers had witnessed firsthand. So illegal killings, essentially.
How difficult was it for you to get them to talk? I mean, these are people who normally club together. They often actually work out their stories together after a raid about how they're going to tell people about what happened to the raid. And they're usually pretty suspicious of outsiders. So what was it that happened that made them want to talk to you?
I mean, I think it wasn't that I was explicitly doing a report on war crimes. So that wasn't it. It was an opportunity to talk about some of the dysfunction within the command, and that rivalry between the commandos and the SAS. And because of how I was positioned, reporting directly to the Chief of Army and the Special Operations Commander, and the fact that I was trusted and had been listened to before by those senior men, that I think that it was just seen to be an opportunity where some of this stuff could be quite confidentially reported and given to the right people who would hopefully listen, and they did.
I think in your book, Mark, you mentioned the term moral injury, and that's certainly a concept you're also familiar with. Samantha, is that what you were seeing in front of you? People who had suffered moral injury? And can you kind of explain that?
Yeah, so I think it's that that sort of dissonance between what they've experienced and that knowledge that it was wrong, but a powerlessness to do anything about it, something that has then gone on to burden them for years, just knowing how wrong it was. But, I think having or being conflicted between their loyalty to that brotherhood of special forces, or their unit, or their commander, and so that sort of moral injury, which is similar but not exactly the same as PTSD, but really has that same effect, and it really causes people to, I think, shut down and really question so much of their morals and ethics and values. And yes, so I think for some of these guys who I had conversations with, they were so desensitized almost, or emotionally disconnected from what they were telling me. That was what struck me the most. Even though the content was obviously extraordinary, it was the way that they described it, and the way that it was framed to me as just being normal and happening all the time, that's when I knew that there was something really wrong.
Mark, is that what you saw as well? I mean, there are a few people in your book that I regard as heroes, and you probably do too. Braden, who was brave enough to come to you right at the beginning. Dusty Miller, who is a medic. And there are a couple of women that you also talk about, Christina and Louise, who worked in the unit as well. Is that what you were seeing with them?
Yeah, I think one of the things about moral injury that I found was that for the book, I actually met one of the guys who's alleged to have committed the war crimes, and I think we're going to talk about that later. But what I found tragic but fascinating at the same time was the fact that the people with the moral injury were the people who didn't commit the crimes. They are drawn into the crimes through the cover-ups, through the pressure, through the brotherhood and that code of silence. And so they get back to Australia after a deployment, like, say, Dusty Miller, who has a patient taken away from him and beaten to death by a sergeant. Dusty comes home and he starts thinking, and he thinks, why didn't I stop him? Why didn't I say something? Then he starts drinking, and then he starts fretting, and then his relationships crumble, and it's his life that falls apart because of the actions of the perpetrator. And I found that with others, and you know, Christina was a character in the book. She was back at base, and so when the patrols would come back, they'd log all their photographs of the compounds or the bodies with her, and she'd have to enter all the metadata and information that she could. And she's drawn into the cover-up when she's asked to delete photos by this same sergeant who beats this guy to death. And then she suffers because of that, because she feels she's deleted evidence of a war crime. And so everyone I dealt with pretty much suffered from moral injury or some other affliction that has really destroyed their lives. And I often think for these people to talk to me, a journalist, to go in a book is incredible bravery. And that's why I think, you know, I get a lot of abuse from certain sections of the media and the general public. But it's actually these whistleblowers and these brave people that they're slagging off. And that's what I get really angry about, because they are suffering.
Let's just go back to Christina for a moment, because you're talking about the killing of Haji Sardar, I think. He's a man who is shot in the leg, who's taken to a small mosque, thrown over a soldier's shoulder, taken to a small mosque and then killed. And photos of that raid go back to the base, and they have to be compiled by Christina. She receives a visit from a guy called Soldier B, who I think is described as a psychopath by some of his...
By his colleagues, yeah.
Colleagues. Tell us what he says to her, what he does.
Well, she, as you say, compiles the photographs. So she's got the photographs from the raid. It shows the compound. But interestingly, it shows an AK-47 in two different spots. Again, suggestion is it's a throwdown. She thinks that's a bit suspect. But there's also a picture of this elderly Afghan man called Haji Sardar, who is one of the victims of the raids, over the shoulder of a soldier. He's been carried somewhere. Now, what she doesn't know is that Dusty Miller was treating Haji Sardar for a flesh wound through the thigh. It was non-life-threatening. Soldier B comes over, grabs the guy and says, "I've got him." Haji Sardar is taken down an alleyway into a mosque and is later found by the locals with boot marks on his chest and around his up towards his neck, and he's dead. So she's compiling the photographs. She's got no idea really what's happened out there. When Soldier B comes into her office, which is not a usual thing, he's a senior sergeant, and he says, "Run me through the photographs." And she sits down and he leans over her, and he's a very physically powerful man. And he puts his hand on her shoulder, and she said her heart nearly leapt out of her chest. And he's going, "Show me this one, show me that one." And they go through it a couple of times, and then he says, "Delete that one." And it's a picture containing one of the AK-47s, because it can't be in two places, right? Then we go through a bit more. Stop on that photo. And it's the photo of Haji Sardar being carried. So it suggests he was taken somewhere. Delete that one. And she has no idea what's going on until years later, when I do a story about that raid and the allegations that this guy was beaten to death, or stomped to death to be more accurate, and all of a sudden she falls into a giant heap because she realises potentially she has some role in the cover-up. But to her credit, she got my phone number and she messaged me one night with a simple message, and it said Soldier A, and she named him. Soldier B, she named him. Soldier C, she named him. And I'm assuming it's a man, one of the soldiers who went out on the patrol. And then we got in contact, and, I spent many days with her. She'd come to my house in Brisbane, and she'd sit on my back deck, and I'd make her this absolute shithouse coffee, instant coffee, which is a crime in itself. And she'd sob, and she blamed herself, and it was heartbreaking to watch her think that she was culpable in the killing of this man when really she was unwittingly drawn into the cover-up. And, yeah, I just felt so sorry for her and people like Dusty Miller.
There was an inquiry into that particular killing only 4 months later, wasn't there, by the Defence Force team sent from Australia. How would you characterise that inquiry?
Well, I somehow got my hands on that secret report. And look, seriously, my Year 7 daughter could do a better job. They misnamed the victims. They got facts wrong. They got the photographs of... There were 2 victims that day, Haji Sada and a younger man called Mirza Khan. They got that wrong. They swallowed the SAS patrol's line that they'd concocted in the time between the killing and the inquiry, that Haji Sada and this other guy were carrying an AK-47 and a grenade, so they were both shot and killed. And, Haji Sada was fatally wounded. Now, I remember asking Dusty Miller, was he ever asked... I said, were you ever interviewed about that? Because you're on the job, you're treating that guy. And he said, funny you should mention that. He said, we were back in Perth by the time that inquiry kicked off, and he said, I got a phone call from Soldier B, and he told me that the inquiry team were coming, and all he said to me is, we're good, aren't we, Dusty? Mm. And Dusty said, yeah, mate, we're good. And Dusty, I had to push him. I said, so you went in and lied? And he said, well, look, the inquiry team were that hopeless, I didn't have to really do that. I just really didn't tell everything. And we talked about it. And then, so in the years that followed, he then got a new layer of guilt from telling fibs, basically, to an inquiry team. That was his chance to basically...
Come clean.
Yeah, but I talked to a lot of guys in the regiment, and they said, if you fessed up... One guy said to me, if you fessed up, you'd get a bullet in the back of your head, and they'd just say it was the Taliban. They were talking about throwing guys out of helicopters, and I said... I was talking to this, he was an operator, and Dusty was with us, and I said, oh, come on, throwing you out of helicopters? And Dusty said, mate, some of these guys were so unhinged, I believe that would have happened.
Samantha, your book highlights the conditions in an organisation that lead to this kind of breakdown and dysfunction that we're just hearing Mark talk about. You say that power flowed differently in some special, excuse me, my voice is cracking up, in some special forces units. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, what I meant there was that is that there were those operators on the ground, so those sergeants, corporals who had, I guess, the street cred, who had been deployed multiple times, were really confident in what they were doing, and then there were the officers who had come over to who theoretically were above those soldiers, but really didn't have the same authority. So in my book, really what I try to describe is this difference between chain of command authority and influence. And so really the power was at those lower levels with those operators who were out, day in, day out, and who were in these really tight-knit, very independent, autonomous groups going off doing whatever they thought was right and reporting it back how they thought it should be reported back. And so that oversight wasn't there. And in the Brereton inquiry, really what Brereton does is, I think, in a lot of detail, talk about the the fracturing of those accountability mechanisms or that governance framework that was meant to sit over the top of those platoons or those units.
Yeah, I think the patrol commanders, for instance, who go out on patrol, I think they were described by some as demigods, is that right? And that even their senior officers didn't question them? Samantha?
Yeah, that's right. They were seen as gods. And have I frozen?
You're frozen, but I think you're not frozen now.
Great.
Yes, sorry.
That's right. It wouldn't be Zoom without a technical hiccup or two.
We're so used to it now.
Yes. Those patrol commanders were, looked up to in awe, and that's part of the problem here, and that's why it's so important to talk about it and understand it. And to make sure that it doesn't happen again when so many people look up to those senior soldiers.
Based on your research, the SAS seems like a classic example of how dysfunction can occur in a group or an organisation. It's elitist, it's arrogant, it's physically isolated in Perth, it's secretive in the extreme. I'm reluctant here to use the word culture after reading your book, because you say trying to change culture is probably not the right way to begin to address the SAS problems. What do you actually mean by that?
Yeah, so I think after having spent so many years looking at organisational culture, not just in the military, but in other institutions, culture can become a bit of a scapegoat and something that's sort of inherited by the leaders of the time, but not necessarily owned, I guess. And so, there's a lot of kudos comes with calling a big culture review and doing this big examination. But I think sometimes it doesn't enable that closer look at the structures that are holding certain things in place. So certainly in the research I did for my book, I found that, not just in the Australian Special Forces, but in other countries' elite units and police forces and in other institutions, these sort of tight-knit groups who are isolated from the rest of the organisation, who are given special provisions and a lot of autonomy, they're more likely to have something go wrong. That sort of code of silence or secrecy that they thrive in becomes really problematic sooner or later.
Mark, in your book you talk about the base culture, and I shouldn't use that word anymore, that was operating as well. Can you tell us a little bit about that, even how they were operating both at the base, back at the base in Afghanistan, but also at the base in Perth?
Yeah, what I found really interesting is I spoke to a lot of the spouses and partners of the SAS operators, and I remember they have a pub on the base in Perth. It's called the Gratwick Club, named after Percy Gratwick, who won the Victoria Cross. It's called the Gratto. And some of the wives would describe how the Gratto was up on a bit of a rise and they could see their partners' husbands up there cavorting with the strippers. Sometimes they go and drag their husbands out and everyone would be naked. One woman described how they took the kids up there the next day because it had to double as a little playgroup area and the strippers' pole hadn't been put away. And I just think I got videos of them playing nude twister with strippers and stuff like that and everyone cheering on. Okay, and you get guys going, well, what's wrong with that? You go, well, hang on, aren't these guys the most elite soldiers we have in the military? And look, the fact is, you take, whether you want to call it culture or not, you take that with you wherever you go. And to me, it showed a level of an unaccountability. And, of course, then they go to Afghanistan. The average Joe soldier, well, they can't drink on deployment, but the SAS has its own bar called the Fat Lady's Arms in Afghanistan. In 2009, they're on operations. They kill, an Afghan man who has a prosthetic leg. Of course, that's the subject of a particular defamation action at the moment. They souvenir the leg. They use it to drink out of back at the Fat Lady's Arms and the Grotto in Perth. They drink out of dog bowls back in the Grotto because some of their dogs were killed in operations, and that's what you do. And the behaviour at the Grotto, I spoke to one operator at the Fat Lady's Arms, rather. He said one night, I'd had a pretty rough week. We'd been out on a patrol. We'd hopped off the helicopter, and Soldier C, the guy who killed the Afghan in the Four Corners report, he levelled his weapon at this disabled guy. He was clearly disabled, and Dusty Miller was there too, and he saw it. And he said, just blew this guy's head off. And anyway, we go back to base, and the patrol commander says, good on you, Soldier C, you took out a high-value target. And they're all just shaking their head. And Tom, in the book, he just got up and he walked out of the patrol briefing, and you just do not do that. Anyway, a few nights later, they're on the booze at the Fat Lady's Arms, and they come to get him, and they actually physically knock him out. So you've imported the drinking culture from Perth, and then the drinking culture begets a sort of more violent culture of retribution for people who don't toe the line. And so, what starts out as a few beers at the Grotto, turns out to be strippers. Then, that creates dysfunction with families there.
I mean, you talk about domestic violence quite a bit in the book.
Yeah, I spoke to, a number of women who were the subject of domestic violence, and that was the other secret war, wasn't it? They're waging this secret war in Afghanistan that the Australian public has no right to know about. Meanwhile, some of the partners back home are also the victims of this secret war. And to me, I just don't get to this day how it was never pulled up, that culture. Do I like a few beers? You bet I do. But I would hope that the most elite military unit in the Australian Army would show a little bit more self-reflection and discipline.
I want to talk to you both about accountability, because I drew up a timeline this morning. I got a bit disturbed by all of this, what happened when and when reports were coming out. And what happened in that timeline was that I realised that really from about 2008 on, journalists were telling these stories, people were talking. I think in the Defence Force there was an email where the head of Special Forces wrote to the Chief of the Defence Force outlining his suspicions. And this was happening time and time again from about 2008 onwards. You did 20 reports before your Four Corners report. Nick McKenzie, Chris Masters. I did some stuff on Australian Story as well. And you're behind the scenes doing all of this stuff too, Amanda. And yet we have to wait until really only a couple of years ago before they go, hang on a minute, let's really have a look at this. Samantha, why is that?
I believe it took the right leaders to be in charge at the right time. I think that there was not... Look, I don't think it was unknown that there were problems. Look, I know it wasn't unknown that there were problems within Special Forces. It was well known. I think there'd been, chiefs of army who were not from Special Forces who they didn't really want to know about it. And I think it took Angus Campbell and Rick Burr and Jeff Sengelman and the kind of men that they are to ask the right questions and to not shy away from, the evidence that was very clear and mounting. And, they wanted to do the right thing. So, and I think they have done the right thing. So we talk about, I know there's been a lot of sort of backlash from certain veterans groups or certain parts of the community that, say there's been no accountability from senior leaders. And yet I think they've, absolutely done something that very few, if any, countries have done before, which is initiate an inquiry to really look in detail at what's happened. And the Brereton inquiry, it wasn't something that was rushed and done over 3 months and hurried through. It was given the time that was required.
I mean, as you say, there were people inside who wanted change. Sengelman, of course, was the person who sent you down the track that eventually led to the Brereton inquiry. He's retired now and there's a new boss in charge of Special Forces. Is there still an appetite for reform in there, do you think?
Look, I think there is an appetite for reform, but I think would be naive to not acknowledge that there'd also be a large part of Special Forces who are hoping to wait out this reform process. It's like many defence reforms that, are sort of in the media for a while, are really politically sort of hot potatoes, and then something else happens, whether it's submarines or a war or an impending war, and this sort of becomes background noise and the organisation moves on. And I think it's incredibly important that we don't allow that to happen. And already, I mean, I've personally felt that, threat from government to stop talking about it. And that, something that is, like the Monash publishing series is, titled In the National Interest, and this is in the national interest.
Yeah, let's talk about that threat that you've had from government. I mean, this is a little book, but it certainly caused a lot of stir, Samantha. A little book with big ideas, I might say. Peter Dutton, I think, even before it was published, tried to stop it. I don't think he'd even read it. Is that right?
That is right. I don't think anyone had read it, apart from Louise Adler and a few others. So I think it was there was some kind of threat of what it could contain. But even then, I mean, it was interesting that there wasn't no one asked me to read it beforehand. And yeah, I think that the first editions that were published were pulped so that it could be closely examined for any breaches of national security or the like. So the process of that occurred. And, it was allowed to be published. But even since then, I'm now trying to navigate threats of legal proceedings from the Australian government done to the Defence Force and the Commonwealth.
So the book has been published, but you're still getting threatening letters about what you say in public. Is that right?
Yeah, so the message to me that's fairly loud and clear is shut up and go away, and you've sort of done enough. And, it's taken me a while to get my head around that, and now I actually find it quite motivating.
And I think Peter Dutton has also said that it's unlikely that you will be rehired by Defence Force, which is it's kind of outrageous that he said that, but it also is about your livelihood. I mean, it's a classic case of shoot the messenger, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if I think, 12, 18 months ago, I was running a very successful company in Canberra, and, I've now relocated states. I find myself not working and really trying to work out what the hell happened.
Yeah. Pretty appalling. Mark, there's also been attempts to shoot you as a messenger as well, haven't there? They haven't been, it certainly hasn't been the Australian government solicitor, which is what Samantha is facing at the moment, but there have been other attempts to shut you up.
Yeah, I'll leave the top end of town to Sam, I think. Mine are from sort of the opposite end. When the book came out, I knew that there'd be some people who didn't appreciate it, and it started to bubble up on social media where most of the sewerage does. And, you know, people abusing me about it on Instagram and Twitter. And I remember one guy, it was sort of a bit funny at the time, really. It was one guy, he wrote on Twitter, I just won $285 on the pokies, so I went out and bought 9 copies of your book and I threw them in the bin. And I was like, keep buying them, mate. I don't care what you do with them. And I'll read you another one I got that I just thought was a classic. It was from someone called Andrew Robinson, and I'll name him because it was on Twitter. He wrote, "Imagine having the balls to put your name on a book of that nature. Coward." You know? And then the video, and I'd retweet this thing, and this is fantastic publicity. And then it sort of got a bit weird, you know, with the people posting videos of themselves. The one guy took it to a shooting range and shot it up. Another guy put petrol on it and burnt it. There was a lot of guys saying they were going to wipe their behinds with it. There was obviously a fetish thing going on there. Then it got a bit beyond weird and, you know, I kept getting phone calls from no caller ID numbers, which I wouldn't answer, and it'd go through to voice message, and it'd just be tirades and foul language and stuff. But then one day I got a voicemail just basically saying, look, I'm a dog, C, expletive. I hope your kids get COVID and I'm going to slit your old lady's throat. And I just said, righto, well, you've stepped over the line. And so we went to the police and a guy's been arrested, and it turns out he's a former ADF reservist of no great note. But as soon as that hit the press, all the cowardly trolls sort of went away for a while. And so, yeah, I think the one thing they all have in common, other than cowardice, because they all tend to hide behind anonymous names, is the fact that they haven't read the book. And if they read the book, they'd probably understand that it's about good people who do the right thing. Whilst there are characters in the book who obviously do the wrong thing, there are a lot of good people in there who've struggled and shown great bravery to tell their story.
Samantha, your partner is actually, or was or is a member of the Australian Defence Forces, and he has been suffering from PTSD. Could you talk about what the attacks on you have meant for your partner?
Yeah, I mean, we've had, you know, a number of years now of threats to myself personally, to my family. I mean, you know, and even as Mark described, these guys aren't particularly smart. The ones I get don't even tend to block their number, so they're very easily identifiable. But that sort of constant, I think, threat or just vilification, really, you know, and I think it goes to, like, it does. I mean, it has had an effect on me. It's had an effect on my husband and kids, but it's a similar effect, I think, that it's had on you know, other people within the Defence Force who, you know, may not be in special forces or may not have even deployed to Afghanistan, but just that shame of what their you know, family, their defence family, or, you know, can do to other people. So I think it's, you know, that's where that moral injury comes up. This has affected not just the people who were witnesses or special forces and their families, or, you know, the people who are whistleblowers or journalists who have reported it. It's affecting tens of thousands of people who look at this and really question, you know, when they put that uniform on, you know, what are people seeing? And that's also why I think there's this obligation to understand why these war crimes occurred, and make sure that they don't happen again.
We've got a short time for questions. Could I encourage you to come to the microphone at the centre here if you want to ask a question? And I'll also encourage you to make it very short and no statements, or I'll be sitting you down. So, have we got someone there? Yes, thank you.
Thanks so much for your work, both of you. I'm interested in the relationship of people like Kerry Stokes and other powerful, influential people in the country, and why they would be supporting these, fairly sort of, lower-level soldiers. It's not like they're the top brass or anything. So what's going on there? What's the relationship between the sort of top end of town, rich and powerful, and this need to be protecting these criminals?
Gee, who wants to go with that one?
I'll have a quick crack, and I'll just check if my defamation lawyer's in the crowd. Look, Kerry Stokes has had a long association with the War Memorial. He's Perth-based, where the SAS is based. So I think he feels a great loyalty to them. I can't really answer that because I don't really know. But the SAS certainly has some very powerful and well coined up friends. I know Gina Reinhardt has also or is going to contribute money to a trust or a fund to defend anyone charged with war crimes from the Special Forces. So, these aren't defenceless individuals with no money behind them. If we get to criminal trials, which will be a historic moment, a sad moment in the history of this country, they're going to have some seriously good legal representation, put it that way.
As we've already seen in Sydney. Next question.
Mark, the modus operandi of the SAS changed quite dramatically during the course of the Afghan war, from covert observation and information gathering to this open capture and kill process. Do you think what has evolved would have always been there in terms of this culture had the modus operandi not changed, or do you think that encouraged what was going on?
I think it encouraged it. We all remember the Vietnam War, and the SAS, the Australian SAS, had a very good reputation for doing what it traditionally did: long-range patrols, reconnaissance, surveillance, getting in, getting out without being seen. The Viet Cong actually called them Ma Rung, phantoms of the jungle. They had great respect for their enemy. I don't know what happened, but certainly in Afghanistan we changed from that reconnaissance, surveillance, long-range patrolling ethic to this kill-capture stuff that's, the Americans get involved in. It's glamorised in Hollywood movies. And I spoke to an army general who told me in the book, he sort of said, when we first went to Afghanistan, these guys are all wiry fellas who could go out and patrol, drink their own piss if they had to because, that's what you do and you're hiding out. And he said by the time Afghanistan ended, they all looked like wallabies second rowers, with big Maori tattoos and bespoke weapons. So, yeah, it changed. It changed for the worse.
Samantha, do you want to add anything to that?
I think perhaps just to the previous question, though, just that I think there is an allure around Special Forces. There is something that people want to be a part of, and when certain Victoria Cross recipient, was sort of really hero worshipped, and his portrait, in the front of the. I mean, it's enormous in the War Memorial, and I think there's a bit of, saving face to do about who certain people have invested in and who they've backed, and I would hope that perhaps light is dawning.
Next question.
Hi, the shooter of the man in the grass, he was asking for orders. Did he get orders to shoot? And how far up the chain of command does responsibility go, both operationally and systemically?
Well, I've spoken to a lot of SAS guys who served alongside that individual, served on that deployment, and their argument is he doesn't need orders. He has the right as an SAS operator, if he's in a situation that meets the rules of engagement, he can engage and shoot an Afghan now who's posing a threat. Now, in that case, it seems to me he was doing a bit of arse covering, and he did propose that question 3 times. Do you want me to drop that C? We believe we did some sound engineering, and we believe that on the 3rd occasion the answer was yep. So he was authorised, but by the same token, every other SAS operator who's seen that footage and has spoken to me said there is no way they should have pulled the trigger in front. In fact, one guy said to me, he said they spend about $1.7 million training each and every one of us, and he said we should know when to pull the trigger, but more importantly, when not to.
I'm getting signals that although we could talk to you both for hours about this, that we have to wrap up the session. What I want to do is encourage you to go and get both Mark's book, Rogue Forces, and Samantha's book, Bloodlust, Trust and Shame.
You can burn them, put them in the bin.
No. These are not easy reads, but they're essential reads for us as Australians to know how we're operating and how people are operating in our name. This is our responsibility as well. So please, please, please thank Samantha for braving the Zoom. And Mark.
Thank you.
And let's also give a round of applause to those people in the Defence Forces that were brave enough to speak to both of you. Thank you to you for being such a great audience.
Thank you, Sharon.